So what we're going to be looking at this morning over the next 40 minutes or so, those of you familiar with the format, we'll do about 40 minutes or so of presentation and then throw the questions and answers open to you to ask questions. Today, the agenda looks like: what are international commercial terms? What are they for? That takes us on to Incoterms, abbreviation for international commercial terms, an internationally recognized set of rules. Tell you a bit about the history and what those are for, and what they do, and then what they don't do. So that'll cover quite a lot of areas actually, in terms of why we have Incoterms, how you use them, what they can be used for, how they are really there to make to give clarity over what responsibilities you have and what costs you're going to have in terms of freight, shipping goods from the UK to another country around the world. Okay, and this will obviously have an impact on cost of goods sometimes, more so than others, and we'll be looking at that as well. So Incoterms, you may be familiar with the term, may not be. If you're not familiar with the term, you've probably heard phrases like Ex Works, FOB, CIF. These are the terms that are covered within Incoterms. Incoterms, just very briefly, as an introductory line, are clarifying the responsibilities, where the risk transfers between you, the seller, and your buyer, and who's paying for what when it comes to shipping the goods. So let's get a move on and look at this subject. So there are, of course, a number of supply chain responsibilities when you're exporting goods, when you're moving goods, and moving goods means doing paperwork, making declarations, both declarations to check that the goods are clear to leave the UK, and then obviously to enter the territory of your export customer. This can sometimes mean paying duties at import, and throughout that process, which we're going to look at in a few minutes in a bit more detail, there is risk that things could go wrong, get lost, paperwork could be wrong, and this could have an impact on your profitability. Of course, it's not always going to be the same in terms of your customers and yourselves and who does what, and this subject can be quite complicated. So I'm going to say straight up front, as I did with those of you that were listening to the documentation webinar we did, number 3 in this series, you'll need to work with your carrier, your freight forwarder, looking at responsibilities, who's doing what. You'll also need to be working with your customer, that could be of course a distributor, to understand where the costs and risks are exchanged, if you like, and you may well need to be talking to organisations like the Chamber of Commerce. And I will be saying at the end that this is a mere 40-minute quick introduction to Incoterms, and the experts really in terms of training on Incoterms are probably the Chambers of Commerce. There are some export training companies out there as well, but very often it's you'll need to go to the Chamber of Commerce for a half-day training course to really fully understand and interrogate what all the Incoterms mean to you as a business. So the history of Incoterms, it's a registered trademark there. You can see Incoterms, a little r. Incoterms were created way back in 1936, and they've changed as time has gone on. And we're now running the latest version, which was launched by the International Chamber of Commerce, who launched Incoterms back in 1936. We're now on the 2020 set of rules. They've changed about every 10 years for the last few decades, in fact. And if you want to know what Incoterms look like, here's the book of Incoterms, which explains all about what, in far more detail, I'm going to explain to you in 40 minutes. There's 190 pages in this set of Incoterms. And if you were to do an Incoterms training course, you'd almost certainly get given a copy of the Bible, if you like, on Incoterms. So they set out to make it clear to people trading goods around the world, who may not, of course, all speak the same language, may have different understandings of different phrases, and the Incoterms set out to ensure that the set of rules mean that everybody understands the same thing when they are used when they're using Incoterms to move goods. And Incoterms are actually, the Incoterms are published in a lot of languages. I can't remember exactly how many languages, but a lot of languages. And you will be using Incoterms and quoting them on your invoices, on your contracts, on your transport documentations, and of course on your quotations as well. So all the documents through the process of making the sale and delivering the goods, you want to quote the Incoterms, and we'll show you what that means as we go through. So quoting Incoterms gives you certainty in who's paying for what and where the risk transfers from you, the seller, to your buyer, and of course does the same thing for your buyer, so that it's Incoterms help to clarify the situation on who's doing what. That's the main thing to bear in mind. So let's look at what it all means. Incoterms, as I've said, clarify how functions, costs and risks are split between you, the seller, and your buyer in connection with delivery of goods. So it's only goods we're talking about. And there are some critical points, and these are the critical points determined in the Incoterms rules: delivery, the risks, the obligations on the various parties involved, and how the costs are split between each of the partners in the contract. Terms range from a situation in which everything is fundamentally the responsibility of the buyer at one end to the other extreme, where everything is fundamentally the responsibility of you, the seller. And if we just look at this this graphic across the bottom, some of you will remember seeing that yesterday when we were talking about pricing. Here's you, the seller, on the left hand side, your buyer in wherever they are in the world, is point number 12, if you like. And throughout the process of shipping, there are these various key points that are going to have to be met by somebody. So there is an obligation to ensure under Incoterms that everyone understands who is responsible for which part of the process. Obviously, you, the seller, there are, from the point where the product is leaving, the goods are leaving you, there will be documentation required to clear the goods. Might be elements of export control if you're selling dangerous goods, for example, or goods for which there are controls put in place by the government. There is then a carrier going to be involved, so getting your product, your goods, from wherever it is that you manufactured or finished them, usually on a van, of course, to a point where they are going to be departing the country. That could, of course, be a terminal. So very often you'll see container terminals are in the middle of the country. They don't have to be around the ports or airports. There could be a consolidation going on in a terminal. The goods have then got to be cleared by the UK Customs so that we know what's leaving, and it's recorded as leaving, and checked that there is no obligation for you that hasn't been met, for example, for export control documents. The goods will then potentially sit at a port or an airport. May not be very long, could be for some time, whilst they're waiting for the aircraft or the ship to turn up to be loaded, for the goods to be loaded onto the ship, and then of course transport across to either the country directly where they're going to be delivered, or of course there could be an intermediary. Think about selling something to Australia. It could be that the first ship takes them to Dubai, perhaps, where they're unloaded, held on a port for a period of time, waiting for a next ship, which is then going to take them on to Australia. So there could be various breakpoints in the journey. Certainly in the case of the aeroplanes, of course. Then cleared into the final territory eventually means that customs are going to have to check whether there are any duties payable, that the goods are safe to import into the target country, and recorded accordingly. Again, could be sitting on a dock, sitting on a terminal, containers being split and so on, and then a van through to your buyer. So there's an awful lot of parts to this process, and needless to say, the carriers, the terminals, the customs, the shipping companies, the loaders, the unloaders, they don't do that for free. They are going to charge somebody for their work, or for the storage of your goods and so on, carriage of your goods. So a lot of costs potentially coming in there. along with uncertainty and potential risks. So we've got to be sure that we are covering the potential risks where something might go wrong. We've only got to think about the snowstorms we've had, they're having in North America at the moment, bringing things to a halt, things being slowed down, and the government changes we've seen with leaving the European Union and some of the paperwork rules that have been changing there, to see that there is potential for delay as well, and that will of course have quite an impact on some types of business. So being really careful to know this. There are 11 Incoterms, and we're going to cover those in just a moment, to explain how the sharing of the risks and the costs can vary at various stages through this whole process. So Incoterms 2020, to be compliant with these, you need to understand that some countries may prefer to use certain Incoterms, some sectors may normally use particular Incoterms, and you need to be aware of those things in deciding which Incoterms you use. But to be compliant, the buyer and the seller must consider their responsibilities. It doesn't there's no differentiation between where goods are going to or coming from, and you must therefore carefully consider which Incoterm is going to be right for your types of goods, the risks involved in the transportation and movement of them to another country, and what's going on in the country that you're selling to as well. So quite a lot of things for us to think about. So these days, since the 1st of January 2020, when Incoterms 2020 came into effect, there were one or two changes to the 2010 rules, some renaming of one of the rules, and some of the clauses within some of the rules did change in 2020. It's important that you use Incoterms 2020 when you're quoting the Incoterms on your paperwork. If that's what you mean. There are some Incoterms which are now no longer in use, which stopped being used, say, in 2010 or 2000, and if you were to find yourself using those purely by accident, it could cause a lot of confusion. So there are 4 groups from 2020 and 11 Incoterms. If you're new to Incoterms, you're wondering where A and B are. There is no A and B. Groups E, F, C and D are in that order quite deliberately, because they build up the exporter's responsibilities. So we'll come on to why they're called E, F, C and D in a moment. But Group E is where your responsibility ends pretty much at your premises, and your buyer will be responsible for most of the activities that are needed through the process. Group F means that you are loading the goods and clearing them free of export formalities. They're clear to go, if you like, out of the UK. Group C means that you, the seller, will be paying carriage, but not taking any of the transit risk. And Group D means that you have the most responsibility. Group D is the ones where you have the most responsibility, where you're responsible for delivering to the named point of your customer, and you have the risk, you bear the risk right the way through to that delivery point. So obviously this is going to have a huge impact potentially as well, of course, on your price, because if your responsibility stops at your own premises and the customer is going to pay all the shipping and so on, that's going to have a beneficial impact on your price, which will be lower than if you're if you're responsible for shipping the product all the way through to their delivery point, in which case you're responsible for all the carriage, and that will impact on your costs and therefore on your price as well. So these are things which we need to understand and discuss with customers, and understand the country rules as well. So those the 4 groups, let's have a look at those in a little bit more detail. So there's the Group E. Group E is Ex Works, and Ex Works is probably a phrase that most of you will be familiar with. This is where responsibility is passed to your buyer when you tell the buyer that your goods are ready for collection, and they acknowledge receipt of that notification. Say, right, we will send our van round to collect the product. And of course, for European customers, this can be quite a regular thing, that if you've got customers who are sending their truck over to the UK to buy from a number of their suppliers, they might well prefer to work on ex works terms, because that way they're controlling the cost of the shipment and it isn't falling to you to add the shipping costs to your price. We'll come back to ex works in a moment. The F group means that you're taking responsibility for clearing the customs papers, but your carrier will, the cost will be picked up by your customer. Free on board is one that people often remember. Free on board was used for shipboard transportation. It meant when the phrase over the ship's rail meant the product had been passed over the ship's rail and loaded onto the ship. So if we think of free type products, coals and liquids and those sorts of non-containerized products, perhaps is a more usual way of thinking about it. Incoterms have had to change over the years because the way shipments work has changed. We've had the sort of coming of roll-on, roll-off ferries, containerization, and of course also security implications as well. The group C is where you're paying the carriage predominantly, and sometimes insurance as well. And the group D, as I mentioned on the last slide, is where you're going to be responsible for delivering your products through to the point where your customer wants them. An important point to make on these 4 groups and on the 11 different Incoterms is that 4 of them, as you can see there in the blue in the bottom left hand side of the slide, 4 of them are related only to conventional sea freight shipments. So you couldn't use FOB and then use an airplane to send the product. You couldn't use CFR and then use just road or train or rail. So they're all multimodal transportation Incoterms except those 4. So free alongside ship, free on board, cost and freight, and cost insurance and freight are the 4 that are shipboard only. So let's just, I mentioned ex works. So select the most appropriate term. It's important that you understand the risks that you are taking if you use certain terms and those that you are prepared to take. Ex works is the one term which is ideally avoided when you're using when you're trading internationally. So under ex works, as I just said, the risk transfers to your buyer when you tell them that the product is ready for collection. However, when you're exporting products, as we know from earlier webinars, you're not going to charge VAT, for example. You're not going to be clearing goods effectively. So also with the paperwork. So the danger we have with ex works is that if you pass all responsibility to your buyer to come and collect the product and take it away from your place of work, you will not have any evidence in paperwork terms that the product has actually been exported, and it's absolutely essential that you have that paperwork, because the revenue and customs people could come along to your company, pick you for a spot check if you like, and want to verify that something which you have said is exported and therefore won't have charged VAT on has actually been exported. If you're selling ex works, the buyer has arranged the transport, that transport has turned up, gone away, and you presume has taken it to the country where the buyer is based, but you haven't got any proof of that. So very much something to be aware of is that ex works is not a good phrase, not a good Incoterm to use when you are exporting. You could use it, and many companies do actually still use ex works for exporting, because of course it means less work for you, less cost for you, less hassle and so on. The one thing that you do need to do if you're selling ex works internationally is ensure that you get clarification and evidence that the product has been exported from your that specifies that they should provide proof of export, the shipping documents and so on to you, copies of those certainly within 5 days, I would say. I'd probably say within a couple of days. The difficulty for you is that you've got to make sure that happens, and remember to check that that happens every time that you make an export on ex works terms. At the other end of the scale, we've got delivered duty paid. So delivered duty paid means that you're going to take responsibility for arranging and paying for all of the process elements from 1 to 12 on our little graphic. So you're going to be responsible for clearing the goods for export, the payment, the shipment of the organising the shipping, organising the clearing of those goods when they arrive in your customer's country, and paying any duties that may come about at that point. So of course there are lots of examples going back over many years, and some very recent ones, where a customer may have asked for the sales company to use delivered duty paid. Company includes within their costs and therefore prices the goods to include and all of the process elements, including paying the duty. And then perhaps when the goods are in the air, or more likely on the sea, the duties are changed by the government of the or the customs union in the target market, if you like, and therefore your price is already set, your customer knows the price, they're expecting you to pay those duties, and if they change and go up, and sometimes that can happen quite significantly, you could well be out of pocket because you're going to have to pay those duties. You've accepted that responsibility in using DDP as your Incoterms. So you need to be really careful about those two extreme ends of the Incoterm spectrum, if you like. So you'll select the most appropriate term when you've considered the risk, when you've considered the rules. You'll have considered what your what the market that you're selling into might prefer, or what the normal is in that market and for your sector. But of course the other one is that you're looking to keep your customer happy as well. So you want to do what is right for your customer. Just one point on this, of course, is that you could accept more responsibility, let's say for more of the delivery, which could give you an angle to get a higher price for your products. You could have an extra markup because you've taken on responsibility for the cost of shipping. Let's say you've discovered that it will cost you £200 for all of the shipping and freight of said product. The customer wants you to do a delivered Incoterm, including duty paid maybe. So you know that your costs are going to be £200, but you could perhaps charge them £300 included in your price for all of that, which allows you to make a little bit more of a markup. And of course that can be quite extensive with higher value shipments. So let's just have a look at a couple of the Incoterms in use in a graphical form and see what they mean to you. So let's look at free carrier, which is actually the one that we would say to you if you were thinking ex works, perhaps think free carrier instead. So this is where the buyer organises the transport. So your customer is organising the transport, but you, the seller, are arranging the export, customs and loading of goods, and will therefore have the paperwork to prove the product was exported. So on this chart, if you can see process here, the green arrow is the point at which the risk passes if you're using free carrier from you, the seller, to your buyer, and that's usually at the place of loading your premises. But you are responsible still to you have the obligation to get the export clearance and documentation all cleared, so ensure that the product is free to export. Your buyer is responsible for all the freight costs from the place of loading, your factory usually, and for the transit risk once they've been loaded, and for all of the costs of shipping internationally. And the buyer is clearing the goods for import and therefore is also paying the duties and local taxes as well. So this is giving you clarity of the fact that the goods have been exported, but is reducing your risk, which is then going, the point at which the buyer takes risk is all the way here through this yellow arrow at the bottom of the chart. So free carrier preferred to ex works if you're looking for the minimum effort and cost, if you like, on your side. Just to look at one other one, delivered at place, where you, the seller, are organising the transport and arranging export, customs and loading of goods, but your buyer is arranging the import declaration, paying the duties, which of course, as we've just said, may change, of course, mid-transportation, and they're arranging the final delivery. So here we're going to quote on our Incoterms, for example, if you look at the print, the words underneath, DAP example here, DAP Singapore Airport or Singapore Port. This is here where the goods have arrived in Singapore for your, maybe it's a Singaporean customer, and you're going to pay the freight costs and bear all the risks to the named place, Singapore Airport, but your buyer is going to pay the transport costs as well as the risks from that named place, from the airport to wherever they want to take it to, Singapore, maybe into Malaysia perhaps, and any import duties that are required as a result, any local taxes and any import documentation clarification at the point in Singapore. So that's just looking at DAP and FCA as two fairly commonly used Incoterms, and explaining the way the levels of risk and costs ship. Just to remind you, there are 11 of these Incoterms. We've talked a bit about ex works, about delivered duty paid, and those two in the middle, but there are another 7 as well in the full range. So some thoughts there perhaps on to make you think about where the risk transfers and what costs you're going to be involved in using certain Incoterms. So in terms of practical implications, what you're going to do is you're going to quote, just as a reminder, you're going to quote the Incoterms. So you're going to say Incoterms 2020 DAP Singapore Airport on your quotations, on your shipping paperwork, on your invoices, and possibly as well in your contract. If you've got a contract which is specifying different goods over different periods of time, you might not want to include a specific Incoterm every time, or you might do. So just being really clear that once you've quoted Incoterms, it's giving clarity to you and your customer. There are some things that Incoterms don't cover though, and I'm going to just run through 2 or 3 of those fairly quickly in the following slides. But you'll see the sorts of things here on this slide which Incoterms don't cover. So you know, things like embargoes and sanction restrictions set out by the UK government are not going to have an impact on the Incoterm that you use. The specification of goods will not be affected by whatever Incoterm you use. And interestingly, the top one there, insurance, you probably spotted when I was showing you the 4 groups that some of the Incoterms, just 2 of them, do have a responsibility for insurance specified in them, but the other 9 don't. So we're just going to cover that one in a moment as well. So insurance, each Incoterm makes the seller and buyer consider their risk, but with the exceptions of carriage and insurance paid to and cost insurance and freight, there isn't actually a requirement for either party to insure their risk. You need to be sure that you have covered your risk, and think about that in your contracts maybe, and really think about where the most risk is, for because things do go wrong. Things can get lost and get damaged in transit, of course. So the important thing is that either you or your customer are insuring the shipment, and clarity of that in your contract is essential. So a friend of mine, a guy I used to work with, was a trainer on Incoterms, and he used to tell the story of being actually out in the Hebrides in Scotland and talking to a company about the Incoterms they were using, and was quite surprised at the ones they were using when he asked them where the most likelihood of any risk in the shipment was likely to take place. They said very clearly that it was between Stornoway in the Hebrides and Glasgow, where the product was put onto an airplane, onto a ship. It was just that transfer across the islands in Scotland, and he was surprised. He said to them, you know, why are you therefore using an Incoterm which gives all the risk to you up until the point in Glasgow? You really should be trying to say to your customers that you're using Incoterm where you want to pass that risk over actually in Stornoway in the Hebrides. That's where you are most where you are going to be least at risk. Therefore, this will have an impact on the insurance then that the customer is going to have to pay. So just be thinking about those elements when choosing an Incoterm. And it's not, of course, going to be the same in every instance, but establish where the risk transfers for a sale and for a purchase. Your customer will be thinking different things. Don't forget that there are you know, on a container ship there are 20,000 containers on a ship. Some get squashed, some fall off occasionally, some get lost and get sent to the wrong place. It's a huge logistical exercise, and what you don't want to be doing is finding that you're bearing the cost because you didn't think about the insurance, or that the Incoterm you used gave you a risk profile that you're not happy with. I remember just 2 or 3 years ago talking to a company. They were telling me that they had got an interesting situation at the moment because it was during the Arab Spring and they'd got a large shipment of their product, and they said it had been sitting on a ship waiting to get into Benghazi harbour for 3 weeks. It was sitting there in the Mediterranean going nowhere. I said, how worried are you about that? And he said, well, thankfully I'm not worried at all because we used an appropriate Incoterm, everything was insured, and the risk had actually transferred to our customer. The customer was very concerned and was having to put insurance claims in like crazy because of the product, which is deteriorating sitting there on the sea. But he was very pleased that he had understood fully the implications and had been able to negotiate a contract which meant he was actually not at risk, and that was an event, of course, which he hadn't been able to expect was going to happen. Something else that the Incoterms don't look at is title of goods and where the title actually passes from you, the seller, to your buyer. So this is really probably just looking at things that need to go in your contract, really, rather than the Incoterms element. So change of ownership from one organisation, one person to another, potentially when they've paid when the seller has been paid the full price. But there could be other clauses, of course, and that might be if you've got development costs and you've got stage payments going on for a major contract. So that's up to you to put in your contract to establish where the title of goods actually passes. It's not covered in Incoterms. And neither do Incoterms cover when you're going to get paid. There's no link between the payment terms and between the Incoterms and the payment terms. So it's clear that you need to be in your contract being very clear about when you'll be paid and in what currency you'll be paid, because these aren't set out in Incoterms. It is important that you understand that. And we can take it a step further, as it says there. They don't deal with whether there is even a contract of sale in existence, and they don't define remedies if there's a breach of contract. One thing it is worth mentioning is that because the Incoterms are created, as I said earlier, by the International Chambers of Commerce, one thing the International Chambers of Commerce does provide is access to arbitration. So if there is an issue arising over understanding of who's responsible for what when Incoterms have been used, only when they've been used and when they've been specified in the paperwork and so on, then the ICC could offer access to arbitration there, which might give you some comfort as well. And of course, the big one that Incoterms don't cover is in imposition of tariffs. So when we've got particularly flexible times going on, flexible is not the word, but when things are changing a lot, you can see further down that slide, it says we've had recent examples of increases in duties from the EU to America. The last administration in America had been changing tariffs quite regularly. There was tariff swapping going on between China and America, and these things, of course, were happening almost instantaneously, and therefore companies were not able to predict when there might be a change in a tariff. And Incoterms specify who will be responsible for the payment of a duty, but they don't say what happens. They don't give any get out, if you like, if the duties change from the point at which the deal is done. So if you've included expectations of paying 5% duties under your DDP Incoterm if you're using DDP, and then the duties change from 5% to 15%, you're going to be liable for that extra 10%. Just the fact that you've used the Incoterm means that's the case. It doesn't give you a get out because you now don't like the rules, that don't like the fact that the duty has changed. So this is important to bear in mind. And of course, this has had an impact in recent months, where we've now left the EU, because obviously buyers within the EU have not been expecting any duty changes. Over the years, buying from British companies, they haven't expected there to be any paperwork costs and so on because of the single market. That has now changed, and some of your customers in the EU may be looking, we've read about it in the press quite a lot in the last few weeks, of course, looking for the UK companies to take responsibility for those changes when selling into the EU. So just need to be really careful about doing all your homework, checking all the costs, checking all the paperwork, and so on. It's just got the just in the middle of that slide there about anti-dumping duty. Probably not something which small businesses just starting export, as we've got on the academy, are likely to have. But if you hear the phrase anti-dumping, it's about countries imposing additional duties to take action against goods sold at less than their normal value. There's certainly been cases with Chinese and Indian companies having anti-dumping duties put on them for dumping products in trying to get market domination in volume terms by reducing prices to very low prices. Okay, and then just last one, I think, on this list of not included is intellectual property rights. So just be aware of Incoterms don't cover intellectual property rights. You'll need to be thinking in your contracts about and I would say not assigning property rights to customers or distributors or agents, making sure that you've got these clearly in your own remit. So if we're looking at this as putting things into contracts, you want in your contract to have clarity that the intellectual property is retained by you. You've got to then, of course, have done the due necessary process to, if you want to patent your product or maintain the trademark, copyright, you've got to have done in the territory you're selling into whatever is necessary in that territory. So applied for trademark protection in your target market. Not covered by Incoterms. And then the other one, sorry, there was one more, which is valuing goods for customers. So Incoterms cover the risk, the obligations, the cost and the delivery, of course, that are required in a contract. And but what they're not going to do is tell you how to value a product. So this is all about thinking about the price issues with using Incoterms. You need to have considered carefully what the costs will be for you, dependent on your Incoterm, when you are quoting a price to your customer. As I mentioned earlier on, using a Incoterm which is putting more obligation on you, perhaps for paying duties into the final market and onward transportation and so on, gives you an opportunity to earn a markup, if you like, on that the work you're going to have to do and all those arranging all those transportation issues. But we need to think really carefully about how we're valuing our goods for the customs point of view. So you can't arrange to have a quote a low price if it doesn't represent what the actual value of the product is. So I hope that's giving you some things to think about in terms of pricing. This is the big one for you. So in summarising, think about Incoterms as it says here, a toolbox, things in a toolbox that you'll need to agree a contract. And lots of other things to think about in a contract as well, which you just talked about. But when you're using Incoterms, use them compliantly. So understand what each Incoterm means. There are lots of places on the internet that you can read the Incoterms rules. I would say just one flag, because they changed relatively recently, just 12 months ago, be really careful that if you're reading a description on the internet, on maybe on a freight company's website, that they are talking about the 2020 version of Incoterms. I have seen in recent months still some at the 2010 level, so you'd be reading something out of date. Ideally, get yourself onto an Incoterms course and get hold of the full Incoterms. But thinking about your responsibilities and your costs, thinking about the risks and who's responsible for insurance. And I just sum up this really with one thought for who in your company needs to understand what Incoterms are all about. Typically, businesses that I see, small businesses, tend to assume that the responsibility of Incoterms is the responsibility of whoever does the paperwork for your exporting, the export department, the people downstairs who are putting the products in boxes and doing the paperwork. But in reality, of course, it's actually the business as a whole which is responsible. And people who need to understand about Incoterms, yes, of course, the shipping people, the packing people, the freight, the people who are going to be talking to your freight companies, but certainly the managing director, because it's a company responsibility, if you like. And the one group of people who often don't understand Incoterms and really should do, I find, are your salespeople. Whoever is responsible for making sales and agreeing prices really needs to understand Incoterms very clearly. So if you've got salespeople in your team that are unfamiliar with them, they should be included in the people who perhaps need further training on Incoterms. And as I said earlier on, there are plenty of places where you can go for more detailed Incoterms. I think it's fair to say that if you were to go on an Incoterms course at either a commercial company or a chamber of commerce, perhaps, it's going to be a half day. You're going to be able to talk to experts who deal with these things day in, day out. We'll be able to look at your particular situation, your scenario, the types of products you're shipping, the way you're shipping them, the target markets that you're shipping to, consider all the risks, consider the shipping elements of that. These people will understand shipping responsibilities and shipping processes and so on, and they'll be able to talk to you in a really practical way about what the best Incoterms for you to consider are and how to take them on board.